you've done part of your introduction already, so you're on the roll. No problem there. This will work. Thanks, everybody, for coming out. My name is Dave Sheets. I'm director of the Data Analytics and Data Science programs here at Canisius. I'd like to introduce our panelists here briefly. Jamie Bono from Wellconnected, Jacob Michalski, CEO and founder, Comprehend PT, and Justin Vecchio of the Canisius Computer Science and Cybersecurity program. I'd like to say some quick thank yous to some of the people involved in organizing this. Mark Gallimore and Tyler Kronproject, if you see them downstairs, they've done a lot of the footwork in getting this stuff organized and getting the websites up and getting rooms and things like that for us, so indispensable. We've got another major organizer, Graham Stowe from the Writing Center at Canisius. He may be downstairs with the writing group. Down in Old Main 104, there's an education session going on in parallel with this. We are going to have a mixer afterwards downstairs in Old Main 109, which is the faculty lounge, where we can kind of talk to each other and talk to the folks on the education side. And that's part of what we're trying to do is mix communities here a little bit, exchange ideas, think about generative AI. I've got a list of questions I'll go through, and we'll just see where the conversation goes with it. If you guys have questions, please jump in. Don't hesitate at all. Really, we're talking about examples and solutions and opportunities here, and so it's really about conversation, nothing more than that. So I'm going to ask our panelists to introduce themselves a little bit. So what is your background and expertise? What brings you to the AI sphere? So Jamie, I'll let you start off.
So again, Jamie Bono. Let's see. What was the first question?
What's your background and expertise?
Yeah, so I'm co-founder of, we've just listened to this whole thing, right? So I'm co-founder of two companies, Wellconnected, which is a SaaS company that works primarily with, and both companies work primarily with community-based organizations and non-tertiary healthcare providers, so non-hospital healthcare providers. The hospitals have enough money, they're fine. I also have a consulting practice, so we work largely on data integration, analytics, value-based payment, risk modeling, things like that for nonprofits. So it's fun. So we've been doing data integration. A lot of stuff, like in 2008, everybody got a bunch of money from stimulus money and went out and bought like Salesforce and this other thing and this other thing, and then realized that they had to maintain it. And so we've been, over the last 5-6 years, helping them to combine systems, to kind of streamline things and find efficiencies that, in these gaps. Not every organization can afford a $70,000 Salesforce developer just to make payroll. So, so that was that. And but we're small and we're lean, and so I was very early on interested in generative AI, large language models, what it was able to do in terms of helping me as a developer. Plus, I'm a nerd, right? I'm just a big nerd. My background's in technical writing, technical communication, and technical design, and information design. So I was really interested in how this was going to affect things. So as it grew, I just kept using it more and more, and as it became more and more available, it became more and more useful. And now, not only do I use it day to day, but we're looking at how it could help streamline parts of our software offering as we reach out to more diverse communities and have to deal with issues like translation and cultural competency, these kinds of things. But also how we might use it to enable populations to do things like access the money they're supposed to be able to access, right? So the federal government says, hey, we're going to make this money available for refugee initiatives, but the guidelines say you got to fill it out in English and it's going to be vetted and you got to have all, you know what I mean, and these kinds of things. So how it might help marginalized or disenfranchised communities engage with the larger discourse about health literacy and availability of finances and grant money, things like that. So is that enough?
Yeah, that's awesome.
What was your last name again?
Bono, B-O-N-O.
Oh, like you too, huh?
Yep. Except it's my real name.
So this is my real name.
This is my real name.
This is my actual name.
Yeah. And I'm not a free man of Dublin. So.
There you go. Yeah. Right on. Well, thanks, Jamie.
Thanks, man.
Really appreciate that. My name is Jake Michalski. Yeah.
Take it away.
I went to RIT for computer engineering. I loved it. I love computers. Loved all that.
Sorry. What year did you graduate?
I graduated 22, so last year.
Oh.
Still pretty fresh. I
graduated
very fresh. Very fresh.
2008.
Okay.
Double majored.
Okay. What
Economics and finance.
Okay.
That's the first class that did 2 majors simultaneously on a degree.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's great.
Yeah, because before you used to have to do them separate.
Right, you'd have to. And then that's kind of how my program was. I wanted to do a major in mechanical engineering and computer engineering because I love the hardware aspect of like technology. I love robotics, right? That's the ideal place for me to sit. But that would take me 8 years. So instead, I went for computer engineering. And my whole life, I grew up. My dad was an IT guy, so he told me about computers, and that was cool. Like I grew up loving computers, and my parents always said be an engineer. So I was like, okay, computer engineering. So that's kind of how I got into that space. And now I graduated. I've been working at Moog for about 2 years as an intern, 4 years as an intern, 1 year full time. And I really like it. We're designing really cool stuff, right? We do actuation systems on plane. How do we make the stick move of the pilot, make the plane actually move? And then we're also working on satellite stuff. So I'm writing the code on the satellite that's going to shoot down hypersonic missiles from space with lasers. Like, it's cool stuff. Yeah, like it's awesome, right? But the day-to-day is boring. Like, at the end of the day, I'm writing a test case for one line of code in the whole scheme of things. It's not that much. But regardless of that, I liked it. It was fine. But I always knew I wanted to be an entrepreneur. And so I started a company doing medical documentation with AI. How can we record the patient visit, specifically between a physical therapist and their patient, and use that dialogue to fill in the documentation that's already being done by hand manually, right? So in the current paradigm, they're spending 15 minutes for every half-hour patient visit. So imagine being able to save yourself a third of your day. Now, there's altruistic things you can do that, right? Can we send a physical therapist home after a 6-hour workday because they're getting the same amount of work done? Or do you make them see 4 more patients, right? Either way, the physical therapist is going to be happy because they don't like documentation. That's the worst part of their day. And so our startup is doing that. It's really exciting, really cool. So we're really leveraging this generative AI to comprehend the dialogue between the patient and the physical therapist. So that's what I'm doing now. Actually, I quit my job at Moog officially. So my last day is next Thursday, and I'm going all in on this startup thing. So I'm super excited about it. I think it'll be big. But yeah, that's me, and I don't know. You'll learn more about me as we go. But yeah.
So can I? So that's really exciting because. So in my background, my first real kind of work with AI and machine learning was doing named entity extraction from all scripts free text to determine social determinants of health conditions.
Okay. So you are
because in primary care, people were writing in the free text notes like patient can't get to the pharmacy because they don't have a car, right? But there's no code for that, so it's not getting captured anywhere. So
it's just getting lost.
Yeah. So we were pulling these out and trying to say like, no. These patients aren't non-compliant. Yeah. There are barriers to their care.
Right. There's valuable information that isn't being absorbed because there's no field for it. Right. But it should still be comprehended.
Right. Yeah. And so, what's been interesting is to watch how the availability of these models have made that work not only faster, but it's getting like to be almost obsolete in some ways, right? Like I don't need to do that kind of. I can feed it this, and then the questions start to become about bias, right? And about how it's parsing out things like I don't have a car. Right? Like, but so that's really cool. That's a really cool overlay.
Yeah, it's a cool.
I love that. Thank
you. It's a cool application. Yours is too. Yours is just as exciting. So that's awesome. That's awesome. Yeah, go for it.
Great. I am Justin Del Vecchio. I am an assistant professor in the computer science and cybersecurity program here at Canisius. I've been here full time for 1 year since the fall of 2022. Before that, I worked at a local company called Kubrick. I was a software engineer. I developed applications for the DoD and the intelligence community, and I got my doctorate while I worked at Kubrick, and I decided it's fun to teach in academia. It's really interesting, get to meet with students, and it's a whole different can of worms, essentially. So I did it. And then in December, and actually I had followed the large language models on some projects that I worked on before in industry, so I knew what they were capable of. What I saw released in November of 2022, and I knew what it was capable of in November of 2021, and I said, wow, oh my, OMG, these things have just basically done the impossible. They went from nonsensical, but answers that led you to believe that it was on the right track to being like spot on. And then immediately I just dove into it. I had one student was going to teach a course. I may have mentioned this last week, and I said, here's the book, and he answered all the questions from the chapters with ChatGPT, and I said, okay, that's not going to be good for us, but it's also really exciting because it's a whole different way to program. So I reflect on it, and I know I keep in touch with people in industry through this and through other means, and it's very interesting to see how people are embracing this in different areas. Pure software engineering shops the really big ones and the really small ones and the ones with some enterprising people are just, they're embracing it. They're grabbing it and they're saying, how can we use it? How can we be more productive? If you're a shop that's got somebody who does metrics for your programming, guaranteed you've got some internal project doing like studies, basically how they're doing with it, how they're doing without it. And it's going well, I'll say that much, and we're in the infancy here. I mean, if you like listen to like Bill Gates and other people, we're basically in the warm-ups for like a 9-inning baseball game, and they're already seeing like these surges in productivity. I myself, I had like shelved programming years ago. I'm like, I'm not going to do it anymore. I could do it, might have an idea in my head, but I'm not going to go and search Google and go through 25 different sites and figure out how to extract all this information from a PDF file because I really wanted to get the URLs from this PDF file. I'm just not going to do it. Then along comes ChatGPT. So now all of a sudden, all these research ideas that I've had, I am actually back to coding. But I'm not really back to coding. ChatGPT is coding 98% of it, and then I'm taking 2% of it, and like I'm massaging it and making it do what I want, and then I'm like creating these repositories of open source projects that I plan on releasing. I'm like, oh, this is going to be really cool. I can do this, and I want to add this part to it. And the last thing I'll say is that, like in the last month or so, I've started using. Has anybody here heard of LangChain? Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah. You've heard of LangChain. Has anybody else? So then I started using LangChain. I was like, there's got to be a way to do this. So just look into LangChain. It's a way for you to create your own chat agents, your own QA, and you can do all kinds of things. Create your own chatbot, create your own agents. And I was like, I wonder if I can do all this stuff. And then the other night, I was working on it, and I asked it a series of questions. And it came back and started giving me these answers. And I was like, these are like, projects that like the DoD would have stood up and said, we need the world's premier researchers to go and figure this stuff out. This is a real challenge. And I'm like, and I just sat here with this LangChain and created my own prompt and asked it and then had to do some cascading other questions. And because it's so darn good at relationship and named entity extraction, it started pulling out stuff, and I was like, holy cow. So now it's gonna blow the minds of the DoD and the intelligence community. They know this. They already realize this. They have their own set of problems getting it into those environments. But it's super fun. I mean, it's really fun. I'm like, I'm just going to work on this stuff. Yeah, it's interesting. So I'm really excited to talk to people about it and see how they're using it. And also, I think the last thing I'll say, I can stop talking about it. The other thing I'll say is that everyone's using it. Okay. Everyone's using it. You always think of technology like, it's geared toward young people. Young people are going to use it. Everyone's using it. Like young people, old people, middle-aged people, old people, they're all using it, and they're using it for a variety of different things, and now they're just like going to it all the time for like different stuff. I just hear it from people all the time. They're like, so I'll introduce it to people, and they're like, oh, hey, you know what? Guess how I used it like this? I used it like this. I used it like this. I'm like, oh, that's really cool. It's neat.
What was that called again?
LangChain. LangChain.
LangChain.
CHAIN.
So what are you using for are you using Pinecone for embeddings, or?
I don't even persist them. I did persist it once with Pinecone. Mm-hmm. I persisted it one time, and then I didn't do it after that because I was just doing like proof of concept stuff. Yeah. And I was like, I think there's probably a way I could persist it locally, but I was like, I did it in Pinecone and actually wrote it. I was like, oh, that's really cool. Yeah. There's all these terms and technologies that you just didn't hear about, like in October of last year, and I was like, what the heck's this Pinecone thing? And then I looked at it and I'm like, oh, this is really cool. This is a good idea. Yeah. That's another thing to look up.
So all the linear algebra people are like, yeah, vector embeddings.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Exactly. Super fun.
Yeah, it's cool because under the hood is just math. It's crazy.
Well, I mean, that's the best part of it.
It's
right?
all just math. It's all just math. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I mean, we've come so far since there's that book on, there's that deep learning book with the dog on the front, like it's the painting that was made up of. It was a painting made by something that had only been trained on pictures of dogs, right? And so it was like, I can't remember who wrote it. I mean, that was a couple of years ago, right? That people were like talking about LSTMs, and like, right? Like people were really hot about it, and it turned out that there were, of course, it's just a lot of logistic regressions, not really fast, but like, you know what I mean? But here we are. It's crazy. Right. It's absolutely crazy.
Yeah, it's really stunning, digging through the technology, how simple the underlying math actually is on that stuff. It's it used to be back in the day, it was all these language models, right, and ideas about grammar and how do humans use language and all that stuff, and nope, just linear algebra and thermodynamic diffusion. Anyway.
Yeah, right. Like, we're just gonna keep working on this until the heat death of the universe.
That's what it's doing, right? It's what generates these things. It's just like, wait a minute, I'm suddenly back in physics again. That's home turf. Okay, you've had some great sort of comments about some of the cool things you guys are doing with it. I think that's really been terrific. You short-circuited a lot of my questions here at the moment.
There's more to talk about.
Yeah, there's plenty. So what do you think the strongest points are of generative AI? What are the strongest kind of use cases? Take it away. Go ahead.
I'll start. I think summarization is where it needs to, where it's best used, right? Generative stuff is good, being creative is good, but it's only as good as what it's fed, right? So being creative on things that have already been done isn't necessarily all useful, but if you go the other way, right? If you go for summarization, it's really good at distilling knowledge down, right? From a large block of text into something smaller. Whereas if you ask it to be creative, it'll do it. It'll get your creative juices flowing, but it never truly will ever be creative until we get to the point where it's truly creative. But for now, at least, it's only working on the knowledge it has. It's working on the stuff it's trained on. And so I think distilling knowledge down is where it really shines.
I think it gives experts, there's so many different answers to this. I think the broader impact, right? Like if we're talking about a broader impact, right? Like, I think that it gives experts the ability to communicate very clearly about their field, both within and outside of their discipline. So let me give you an example. So if you, because I work in the nonprofit world, they're usually my examples. So you're the executive director of, let's say, a parent empowerment nonprofit, right? You spend your life chasing grants. That's how you pay the bills, right? And you pay a grant writer to do the research, to build this stuff up, to translate the concepts, but then you have to spend a bunch of your time when you should have been giving direct services or planning programs or improving things, just trying to figure out the best way to say, give me money a different way, right?
Right, at the end of the day, that's all you're saying.
Right, at the end of the day, right? And so I think what it allows is it creates a path to clear communication of complex concepts. So in a way, like your summarization, right? Yeah. That then can be modified on the fly for different audiences, right? And that unfortunately creates a problem for people who want to be professional grant writers, right? Like that's, to be honest, right? Like, but it also shortens the iteration loop, right? Which we all, working in software or working, like, we all know that shortening that iteration loop like really helps with creativity. It helps you to think through the options. Like you don't have to wait 3 days for the model to finish, right? Your ideas are there, and that's one of the things that I think is really generically how it will affect people like my dad, right? Like you know what I mean? Like I think software engineers and scientists and genomics, like these are very different specialized areas, but I think that's the broadest impact.
Yeah, right. Distilling knowledge down for everyone to understand.
Yeah, or being able to, that kind of like, it's on the tip of my tongue, right? Like, how do I explain, right? Like, how do I explain this thing, right? Like, how do I explain this concept of like parent empowerment, right? Yeah. And you can kind of iterate through a bunch of different options by yourself.
Yeah.
By yourself.
Yeah.
You, me, and ChatGPT, right? Like, that's kind of the way,
Yeah.
I'm waiting for that rom-com to come out.
Oh boy, ChatGPT will write it for you, no doubt.
So for me, I think there's so many different things, but two main things stick out at me. One is it is a federated search realization. There's this whole concept of federated search, and that's sort of what Google is. It searches all these different data sources, and it gives you the replies. It just lists them out like 100 at once, and you have to like sift through and go and find like response 2 and 18 and 33 answered my question. And this thing basically collapses it all together and says, don't worry about that. I'm just going to go put it all together and give you the best possible answer. And that like speeds up everything. The second thing that I love about it is that it will always answer my questions. Sometimes I hesitate. I'm like, should I ask it another question? Am I going to bother it? I'm like, oh, no, I'm not going to bother it. It's just going to answer and be happy about it. Because I come from industry and the notorious, RTF, read the F manual guy or girl who is like, stop asking me questions about this. It's like, it's that person, they know the answers, but they'll always just tell you the answers, and there's nothing, like, there's like no, you don't have to worry about it. They're not going to be, you know, they're always going to give you the best possible answers. So I find myself in like long conversations with it where I'm like, well, is it like this? I'll be like, yeah, you got it. And sometimes I'll be like, you're on the right track, but you don't understand this one part about it. And it's just really neat that you can keep having these conversations with it.
Right, that's a great point about like education stuff, right?
Yeah.
I think it'll be a great tutor. I think it'll be a fantastic tutor at some point.
So I think
You disagree?
I do. No, I agree. But so I taught writing for a really long time,
Okay.
right? Like, so I was a college professor, I taught writing and stuff
Yeah.
like that. And I think I am better at manipulating the outputs of ChatGPT because I spent so much time
In writing.
learning how to teach.
Oh, okay.
Like learning that Socratic, like ask another question, shape
Just
the
keep asking
answer,
questions.
feed it back, iterate, like that kind of like, no, maybe a little bit different. That's good, but how about this, right? Like that kind of gentle kind of
Yeah.
co-editing I find to be really, my experience, to be very helpful with. But on the search thing, and please tell me to shut up if I keep rambling, right? But like, can I swear? Are we cool with swearing? Right? So does anybody here know who Cory Doctorow is or read Cory Doctorow? Cory
He's that author. What has he written?
He's written dozens and
I've
dozens
read
of
some
books
of his
about,
books. I
you know,
forget
but
what
he
they are.
but he's worked for EFF for a really long time,
Mhm.
and so he's been Electronic Freedom Foundation. So he's been a very vocal advocate of technology, and his term now that he uses is the enshittification of everything.
That's where we'll go.
That's his term. And so so he points out the enshittification of search, right? Search was really valuable until it was monetized, commoditized, and shifted to the private equity.
Yeah.
And then we ended up not getting real search. We got advertising, and then search.
Yeah,
And then a little bit
that's
more
true.
advertising.
Yeah. Mhm.
And people, I think, have really gravitated towards using GPT for search.
Oh, yeah.
Because it's not enshittified yet,
Mhm.
right? It hasn't been colonized by those equity-driven things, right? Like, and so.
Do they have the capability too, though?
Well, that's what I don't know. I'm just saying that I think that somebody's going to listen. Somebody will find a way to
figure it
monetize
out.
it, right?
Right.
Like, but.
Watch an ad between replies.
Right. I mean, we found out a way. I mean, they did product placement in sitcoms, right? Like a can of Coke. If they can figure that out, they can
Right.
figure it out. But like, that's the thing, right? Like, I think it just hasn't been corrupted yet in a certain way.
Right.
Yeah.
In
it has
its
been.
functionality by the market forces.
Mhm.
It will. I mean, it's consuming massive amounts of technology to tell me silly jokes in a
Right.
pirate accent, right?
Mhm.
Like, but right. So that's part of it, right? Is I think it hasn't been fully corrupted by those market forces yet.
Yeah, right.
The only thing, and maybe I'm wrong, but I'm just going to retort on that. So you mentioned like the federated search results.
Yeah.
Well, if the model learns one particular answer that's really well and it's true and it answers that, what about the other tens of thousands of pages that has similar answers that don't get fed to that model? Is there some way that they also, is it randomly pick among the correct answers, or is it excluding all the other pages? So for example, when you go to Google, you look for something, everybody forgets there's page 2 through infinity that also answered those more or less,
Yeah.
and only page 1. So does the ChatGPT, for example, does it only pick with the specific like top like result from Google that says this is the correct answer for your question?
That's a good point. I want to say it was
David
So
would be
that's-
able to
yeah.
answer this. I know.
So part of that-
the
part of
answer.
that-
So in other words, it's like an
Really
asymmetric answer
Yeah, yeah.
out of the total answer
Mhm.
pool.
Yeah.
Yeah, but Larry Page, I mean, is the only one who knows how the Google algorithm works too, right?
Yeah.
Like, so it's always been black box.
Yeah, you can do a lot of prompt engineering, right? The idea of how do you phrase the prompt to get it to give you a summary, not of one answer, but
Okay.
of one of the predominant alternatives. Give me the top 6 alternatives or
Absolutely.
10 alternatives. So part of that is that prompt engineering, right? Just getting the hang of how you have to ask it, right? I mean,
Yeah.
you get much better results with Google if you phrase things the right way, right? So that's a key word. It's like going into the hardware store, right? If you're looking for some obscure part, if you know the name of the thing, then you can go in and get it, right? If you have no idea what the name of the object is, it's really difficult, right? In a hardware store, right? Because you're trying to talk to the clerk. Well, it's this thing that's sort of, right? You get those weird conversations. It happens to be, used to happen to be constantly. Anyway, they are maneuvering through the training set they've been exposed to, right? So they've got that in there, and then it really is these thermodynamic drift models that have some element of randomness in them. So they kind of do wander through that space. So there is some level of randomization in that.
Now, with the training set, was that, it crawled up all of the internet, or what percentage?
No. You can go back and look at that. It's been a progression, of things, right? So GPT 1, 2, 3, 3, 5, 4, all built up with progressively higher, larger sets. Yeah.
Right.
At one point, I had the numbers written down for that.
I want to say you answered it the last one.
Yeah, I think I answered it the last time. We can dig that up. But it was a massive steps in increase, right? You can download a copy of GPT-2 on your machine, right? You can do that at home and train it, right?
Like 80 gig, right?
Yeah, it's like 80 gig range or 16 to 80 gig range data set. So you can do that on a beefy home machine.
Yes.
But GPT-3 was another
100 gig.
Yeah, 100 gig, another order of magnitude.
Yeah.
And then again about a factor of 8 to get to GPT-4.
Right.
Yeah. And then the cost, I think, the electrical cost for GPT-1 was about $40,000 to train. Yeah, the electrical expenditure, and GPT-4 was like 40 million in electrical costs to train the thing. Yeah, just the runtime. It says around there.
That's interesting. So to go back to your question, as far as like what you're going to get on it, right? The training sets have supposedly trained on the internet. So at some point they will have trained on all results. Maybe one day. As far as what you're going to get in a search result, they don't necessarily give you live results. Like Bing might. Bing might look at the first page results and summarize them for you. But it's all about how that gets built out, right? Will we get to a day where it's going to scrape instantly the first 100 pages and give you the most concise answer? I don't know. Maybe. Maybe not.
Or I could take a sample of the actual series of pages or the actual correct answers, like if it's a specific, say it's a one-word answer or a two-word answer. They could take a sampling of the internet pages and just feed, like you said, use a random model to feature different.
Remember, it's working on word patterns from what it was trained on. So it's not pulling up the original writing.
Exactly. No.
It's working on common patterns of word usage is what it's driven by, right? It's not written to be correct. It's written to sound like a human talking about a subject.
Yeah. So you can actually issue a query to it and have it return to you that big bag of vocabulary that it's going to build a reply with. And you can actually look at like all the words it's going to use, and then somehow it like strings together a coherent reply. That's another part of like GPT. Though like Bing will have their own version of that'll put together the coherent reply. But the two other things are for bias. I mean, my example is who wrote the Pledge of Allegiance, and I'll immediately come back and say 1892. I think his name's Bellamy, wrote the Pledge of Allegiance, and then I'm like, well, wait a minute. Other countries have pledges of allegiance, and like, of course they do. Singapore's got one, India's got one, the Philippines have one. Like, why didn't you answer with that one first? And it goes, oh, my apologies, I didn't think to answer with that one first. Right. But I mean, if you get it, I mean, it's not like it won't answer that. It's just like, when we talk about a Pledge of Allegiance, I didn't know that Singapore had one until like I asked ChatGPT and talked about it. And the other thing is, I get biased too with respect to the code that I get back from it. It will give me like the most prevalent like libraries to use to do particular things. And then I'll be like, you know what, it just didn't do what I wanted. I'm like, just do it all over. This one didn't work. I wanted it to do this particular thing. It got all the way to this point, and then I'll give them like a different library. And I'll be like, well, try this one instead. And then I'll get through it. I'll be like, oh, this one actually worked. I'm like, this one must be like, for what I want to do, this one is a better library, even though, I mean, that's another form of bias. This is probably like the most prevalent one, was the one it offered up to me first. I mean, it's a coding bias. It's like, this is what most of my answers are, but you wanted to do this one particular thing, and this other library happens to be a lot better at doing it than like the most common library. But I find myself saying, this didn't work, redo it.
Yeah.
So let's not pretend that Google results
aren't biased.
And let's not pretend that Google results are not shaped by context at a much longer term than GPT. So Google, say it's a cookie on my machine. My search results in Google are different than your search results. And they're not just different because of that cookie. They're different because I live in a different place. I have a different IP address. I've searched for other things during that session. I have other things installed in my browser. I have plugins. I have these things, right? So the context for Google in a lot of ways is much longer than the context GPT has for my behavior, right? So just literally just open a private browsing session and search Google, right? But I will guarantee that if you search for what is the Pledge of Allegiance and your VPN puts you in Germany, you're going to get contextual results.
Yeah.
Right? Like that's the other thing is that there's a lot of context that we're assuming doesn't, you know what I mean? That gets abstracted away with GPT, or that gets abstracted away with our daily use of something like a search engine. But remembering that context is there is always kind of critical, right? So I get very different results when I forget to turn my VPN back to the United States, right? I like to watch the BBC, so sometimes I'm in England.
Yeah.
I might be in England this evening.
Right.
Right? Like, but my results will be different, right? Depending on that. And so it's interesting. So you got to kind of remember that contextualized search is always going to give you there. Even DuckDuckGo, which is supposedly anonymous, right? Like it's still over the course of 3 or 4 searches is going to, you know. Sure. Remember when the more pages like this button disappeared? I loved that button. Right? Remember after every single search result was like, see more like this? I loved that. Right? Go on.
That's why they took it away, because you liked it.
Of course.
That's what Google does, takes away everything you like.
Yeah. You have a question over here? Yeah.
So I've been thinking a lot since the first session to this one about the data sets, and that seemed to be like a point you guys were driving home. It was a pretty big deal. I'm working on a project right now. I work in like the tokenization and blockchain space. So decentralization is like a huge concept for us, and it's great. And this project is dealing with an area of the world that we would call the global south, and there's some climate change stuff going on, and some of the feedback that's come up is that I didn't even know there was like a global north climate change and a global south climate change, and there's different ideas on how we should solve this crisis and all these things. And from the last meeting till today, I was thinking to myself, well, is there room for like niche data sets that would just only accept inputted data from like a specific indigenous tribe, for example, or something like that? And then do you guys who work in this field, do you see that as like, as you even said, like we'll be able to scrape the whole internet,
right.
But like when you think of these niche pockets, do you see that as something that in the next, now or the next 20 years, at least in this specific moment of time, would be really helpful, or would that slow us down?
I see it being very valuable, especially for like medical field, right? So for my specific use case, I'm using a generic large language model that's just been trained on the internet. I find it very useful and very interesting if I were to find one that was only trained on medical field, right? If we could look at just medical records as the data set that it trained upon, it should be far superior to a general model.
But dude, GPT has been trained on SNOMED, on
it's been trained
ICD,
on
on CPT, right? It's got
It's
all,
also
right?
trained on accounting and finance.
Oh, of course,
All this other stuff that
yeah.
could possibly have poisoned
It's
its
super exciting.
Right. That's a great point. I want to see that world, right? I've thought the same thing as you. It'd be so interesting to have a model trained on specifically Native American history, right? And it was able to give answers that it knew were true because it came from only that data set. It's not going to be corrupted by something else. And I don't know if it's not right. I'm not in the theory enough to say yes or no if that's capable or not.
Yeah, it's pretty easy.
It is.
Okay.
It's really easy.
These tools, the way they're structured, they're modular, right? So you can go GPT-3 and 4 are proprietary, but GPT-1 and 2 are not. You can get a copy of GPT-2, and then if you've got, you understand how it works, take the time, figure out how to reprogram the thing, you can feed in your own data set and retrain. You take the architecture, right, the framework, the neural network that we know works, right, and retrain it on a specific data set. We've actually, there are examples of it. Justin and I have both tinkered around with that on a couple about retraining. It was GPT-2, right?
It was GPT-2,
Yeah,
and it used like Reddit posts.
You have some Reddit posts and Japanese poetry, right? That was the other set one. You could retrain the thing using Japanese poetry.
Are you fine-tuning it with your data sets, or are you like truly retraining it based on the framework?
You're going back. Well, you can do either one,
okay.
right? So in a neural net, you have an architecture, right? The way the neurons are connected. Within that, they have weights. Okay, so humans figure out how to build the architecture that's going to give them the behavior they want, and then they dump the training data into it as a training process. It's usually predicting missing words, right? That's what it does. You take a bunch of data, you pull random words out of it, and you train the system to predict the random words. That gives you the language embedding, the mapping. That's the real breakthrough with all these models, is a really clever way to store language. And so that's how you do it, right? So it's very, very easy to train these. You just got a massive amount of material you want. You set up a randomizer that pulls sentences out of your source material and removes a word here and there, and then you train the system to predict those words, and it learns the word use patterns that are embedded in that set of data. So you can take, so there's a bunch of ways of doing this, right? You can take something like a trained version of GPT-2 and then retrain it on your data set, and then you've got a system that kind of reflects a merger of the two. You can take GPT-2, zero out all the weights, right? Randomize all the weights in it, so you destroy the content but not the structure, and then retrain that yourself. And so, it's a pretty minor thing, right? You can do this in a simple way on relatively modest machines. With a large data set, you're going to put some money into it to do it. But that will be coming, right? There are versions of this that are being trained to handle legal processes, for example, right? All other types of specialized writings. A lot of these things are starting to do it. We got a comment there.
I was going to say, many companies, especially large ones, that's essentially what they're doing with their own internal data sets.
Yeah.
So the question starts to become: is it via vector embeddings?
Right.
So are you using ADA to create vector embeddings? Are you doing something like LoRa or something where you're actually changing, where you're doing local retraining?
Yeah. You can do either one.
Yeah. And so
you can recreate the AI, the feature activity, right, within a large language model learns the embedding, right? So it's this attention-driven embedding. So it embeds words by meaning, and it infers that from the data set, right? Older embeddings mapped words. Each word goes to its own place, right? That was the classic language embedding prior to 2017. That the attention concept was to use the other words in the sentence to tell you where to embed each word. So the word flies could mean a whole bunch of different things, right? Fruit flies like bananas. He's good at catching pop flies. Time really flies. A whole bunch of different ways of use of that. And we pull out the meaning of the word from the other words in the sentence. And that concept in linear algebra is implemented as attention, right? And you can train the AI to figure out how to do that. And so you can take your own data and train the whole AI to figure out what words to pay attention to. Say, are these mortgage documents, right? And learn it to read and write, mortgage documents. You train it on all your mortgage documents, and it figures out the patterns of word usage there.
And I've done it where I've created custom knowledge stores where I've just done the embedding part. I just had a bunch of PDFs about a particular topic. It was all about the Ukraine-Russian war and cyber war, and I'm like, well, I think the embeddings are probably going to be pretty good. It seems like a very popular topic, so I'm going to trust the embeddings. Jammed 32 PDF documents into it, and then just start asking questions and say, just consider these documents. Don't consider anything else. Just query these documents when you come up and formulate your answers, and then you start. And if you've got documents that represent, at this point, you're probably talking like hundreds to thousands of pages of documents that I could never read. But then you can start saying, what are the top 10 topics? List out all the topips in here, and then you can just have a field day and just keep asking more and more questions and find out stuff that you just don't know.
So I think of it a little bit differently in that my first question is, how do you capture that data, right? So if you have a small local community, you have a community that you're trying to get into this space, right? You're trying to get their language and knowledge and cultural, into this space. Where are we getting that data, right? So first of all, do they have access to the technology that we're just scraping all of this out of anyway, right? Is it equitable access, right? Do you have these kinds of things? Are there folk communications that are happening over messaging that aren't like you would use in natural speech, right? So they're closer to a pigeon of multiple languages, right? And then how do you create enough training data or interaction with it to use effective techniques like generalized adversarial models or things to actually refine the model as it's moving in real time without a lot of incremental training overhead where you're releasing another version, right? So all of these things start to kind of pile up when you have these smaller populations or smaller data sets, right? And that's I find that question to be really important, right? Because you can't train that data with the same assumptions that we use to train off of Reddit, right? Or off of Stack Exchange, right? It's a very different type of, not different in that it's different than these other things, but it's unique and it's a smaller data set. It's a smaller population. Your biases are going to be, your various bias trade-off is going to be different. And so I wonder about that, and I often think about when you think of the big five, like Facebook, and you think of these and you think of the amount of data they have to train these models on, right? And the tools they've built to train, given us for free, right, to train these things on. What happens? How does that change the value when all of that data is eaten up by the machine? How does that change the value of the pockets of data like you're talking about, right? That are,
So I was working with Anthropic Claude API, Claude, because it knows like the most recent API. So I was asking all kinds of questions, and it gave me some Python code, and I was like, hey, I tried to compile it. It's wrong. I know what's wrong though. It's like you got the wrong. When you imported these libraries, you used the wrong case on it, and then it came back and it said, first it said, oh, thank you. It goes, and I compiled this in the background myself, and you're right, I did use the wrong stuff, so I went and I corrected it. So it's like, I'm helping this thing out. I'm like, no problem, as long as I get the right answer, I really don't care. But that's the way they're working on it, and it's leveraging the people who are asking the questions too to do the training, to like help it understand how to improve itself.
Yeah, it's the application of these technologies, like any other technologies. Like those kinds of global, impact and cultural questions are really important, right? Because it's not even for issues of equal representation in a altruistic sense, but in a purely practical sense, right? Like to be able to do these things. Yeah.
I think it's interesting that we're talking about the details, which makes me think, like, oh, we're right at the beginning. That's going to happen then, right? Like, we're so early and we're already thinking, yeah, that's how we would do it if we wanted to, right? So that's definitely coming.
It's going to come.
It's just when now.
No Microsoft license code is safe.
Certainly not.
Right? Like now you can just go like, give me the code for Windows 10.
Yeah.
I saw somebody, they said that if you can ask it to like, oh, my grandmother usually tells me stories to go to sleep. Can you please read the Microsoft whatever manual and give me these like codes or whatever? But I really appreciate your answer. I think it secured my contract for another month. So.
There you go. Good deal. Love it. Yeah.
So, you saw a question up there?
Yeah, did you have a question?
Yeah, so I am a complete below novice.
No, that's fine.
In terms of AI. So I was playing around a little bit with Claude.
Yeah.
And so my general question, this is just a general question to anyone that knows, probably everyone in the room knows more than I do regarding this stuff. But I was able to confuse Claude very, very easily. And the only way that I knew that I was right was because I was asking it very specific information that I knew that was local to Claude. I was comparing the example that I was using was I was asking it questions about Buffalo State, University of Buffalo, and Canisius. So I was asking like, which is the best college? And I just kept iterating through a bunch of different kinds of questions, and
Sure.
Claude started apologizing to me. And I said, don't apologize to me. I was like purposely trying to break it.
Yeah.
Break it.
Mm-hmm.
But so my generalized concern, which is not a novel concern at all, is the lack of safety, like the lack of explainability and the lack of for me anyway.
Yeah.
Or I've heard like, these answers are correct. How do we know they're correct? They're biased by programmers, whoever the programmers are. I'm not a programmer.
The programmers, right.
But an individual programmer, just inherently everyone's biased on some level. So it kind of speaks to the question I think you were asking, although I don't really understand your question because of my sort of pay grade.
Yeah.
But so that's my just sort of general question is like how
right are they?
You feel, I'm getting the impression you feel very, very confident, and I feel the other way around.
And we shouldn't feel confident.
I'm not so sure, and I'm just on a really tiny little, which college is better, which college, why.
Sure.
Just a very simplistic,
Yeah.
I'm not running through anything.
Yeah, go ahead.
So go ahead.
So I have a very short answer and a slightly longer answer.
Great.
My very short answer is any tool is a weapon depending on how you hold it. Right? Like, that's, right? Like, it's about how you use it critically, right? The longer answer is, I absolutely don't trust it. but I can see when it works.
Yeah.
So when I use it to help me like pair program, and I refer to it as pair programming. It is not me using ChatGPT. I am pair programming with an AI, which means like I am asking it questions, it's responding with things, I'm refining the code,
Yeah,
I'm
exactly.
resubmitting it back to it, I have a workflow, right? I know when it works and when it doesn't, because I can check the output,
Yeah.
right? And I'm skilled enough to do that. Not just to see that it compiles, but to say,
Yeah.
hey, 1 and 2 does equal 3, right? And it should do that. So I have the ability to do that like anything else, right? When I don't ask it for questions about world history.
Yeah.
It's just not, to me, it's not where I think I may give it information and say, please rephrase this for me to highlight a certain concept or something, right? Or tell me the things. But no, I know when it runs. I know when the code runs and gives me the result I need. I need to be critical about that. But I think it comes down to, any tool is a weapon depending on how you hold it.
With that said, there's a technical term for what you're talking about. It's called hallucination. Right?
Yeah.
These things just make shit up.
They're very confident. So
Right, so you
they're-
can't even
Yeah.
trust it, right? So that's a big thing that they're working on now, and that's what that's my reason why Google isn't ahead. Google was concerned with hallucinations and wasn't ready to publish something that was going to give you wrong answers confidently. And that's why Bard is worse. Bard is Google's ChatGPT.
Yeah.
All right, they had this tech in 2018, and they demoed it, but they never released it because they were worried about the hallucination. That's why I'm convinced. I don't know that's like for fact.
So-
But is that true? I don't know if you could speak to that.
Yeah, there's some of that going on. There was there's a jump to market here, right, on the part of ChatGPT, right? So there's a push to market on that,
Something about regulatory capture that
Yeah.
is really attractive.
Yeah. The other thing about this is, you pointed out, any tool can be a weapon. The other thing is that a lot of people are viewing this as a screwdriver and it's a hammer, right? So in other words, it's not the tool you think it is. It's meant to mimic human conversation based on observed patterns of words.
And that only.
And that only.
Right.
There's no concept of truth. There's no concept in there of self-contradiction.
No morality.
No morality, none of that. It's just replicating patterns of words that it's seen in a lot of training data. The harder you push it, you will eventually push it into failure by getting beyond, the edges of its training set. And then it'll try to come up with a glib answer. I think we've all met somebody who has a glib answer for everything, right? 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 You've met that person, haven't you? Right? And you know that some things you can trust them on and other things you cannot. Right? The founder of OpenAI, the head of it, has come out and said he does not trust the device. The people who developed it have said that publicly.
Because it wasn't designed for that, right? We're
It's
taking it for fact, and it wasn't meant to be that.
Right.
Google wants that. Google wants to get to a world where you can trust the result, but you can't trust ChatGPT. It's just language. I don't know, right? Maybe they don't. Maybe Google doesn't want
Well, it's like Jamie's example, right? You use a simpler one like a cover letter for a job, feed it your
Yeah.
resume, feed
Yep.
it your job description,
Yes.
spit out a 98% perfect cover letter,
Yeah.
go edit it. It's
Yep.
fact because it's all based on what you've read and what you've written. It's helping you. So I think it's just how you're using it.
Right, so hopefully it's a tool and
Yeah.
not determinist, right? So in my specific use case, right, how can we comprehend dialogue for documentation? I sell it as it gets you 80 to 90% of the way there. The PT has to go and read it over and make sure it's right, because it will hallucinate. If you're asking it to generate a specific thing about the patient visit that you didn't talk about at all, it's probably going to give you an answer. It's very rarely going to say, I don't know. I can prompt it in such a way where I can get it to say, I don't know, if it doesn't have some amount of that,
Right.
but it will still hallucinate from time to time, which is a real concern. And that's why you haven't seen that type of tech deployed in real life yet.
So I had a conversation about this today, about medical records.
Yeah.
Right? And so the example started because somebody posted on Twitter a notification that came up on, they're an ER doc,
Okay.
and they posted a notification that came up on their Epic emergency, the electronic health record, right, on Epic.
Yeah.
As they were discharging it, it said, they've since deleted the tweet. It said, because it didn't have patient information, but it said, you're discharging this patient, they have these conditions, is there a chance this patient could require hospice care in the next 6 months? Do you think this patient could die in the next 6 months, and should you recommend hospice care? right? So because the algorithm said this is what you should do, right? Based on, kind of whatever. And then gave them options to template their notes in order to meet standards, because electronic health records exist for one purpose, and that is to bill, right?
It's all about insurance.
It's all about insurance billing, right? So my response on Twitter was, he was like, this is shocking. Like, how does this make an ER doc feel? And I was like, it makes me wonder which hospice your private equity firm that owns your doctor's practice owns, right? Like, because palliative care is 100% reimbursed by Medicare without question. If you're a private equity firm, you want to fight over 70% claim in an ER when you can send them for, anyway. So, the question led to a larger discussion about dragon technology, nuance, which is what a lot of doctors for a long time, was the first real dictation that doctors would use, right?
Dragon dictation. Yeah.
Dragon, it was owned by Nuance. I don't know if it's called Dragon anymore. Okay.
The dictation is the keyword.
Yeah, so it's
What's the name of
like,
that company
Like the
that used to make it?
animal?
Yeah. So I remember like
It's
doctors
called
like
naturally
saying
speaking.
like, I remember doctors saying like, the patient arrived at the, strike that,
Yeah.
arrived at the, strike that, right? Like that was the, and but then led to templating their responses, because their natural language responses led directly to reimbursement. Because if they didn't say this one word, the test wouldn't be authorized and the insurance company wouldn't. Now, this is the insurance of chat, right? Because if you have a model that's custom trained by Epic based on the 3M global capitation or global risk grouper, right? Which 3M owns, right? And is proprietary, you can't see inside it, right? This is the algorithm that makes all the decisions about your care. All of them is the 3M risk grouper, because that's how people get reimbursed. And that's my question. My question starts to become, right? Like, sure, it'll make the PT's job easier, and might make the patient get better reimbursement, right? So the care gets covered, right? But is it the right care, and what's shaping it?
Right.
Now you're disenfranchising the provider's expertise for a larger objective knowledge base that's
It's like that.
so it becomes really complicated when you start looking at those kinds of situations, when you move it out of the local space of I'm trying to write a really good resume or I'm trying to respond to a grant application, right? Because so that's where I start to get scared in those respects.
I can even imagine too, like patients at doctor shop, like if they know what to say and the words to, put in, and they're looking for those reimbursements too, so.
Yeah, it's,
With the drug
so
authorizations.
well, it's hard in New York
Right.
State. Well, I stopped taking
Yeah.
care of a lot of that in New York State. So unless you want to plan on doing identity theft, but it's tough. It's a tough call.
But can I ask you a question? Maybe it's for Jamie, since you're on the healthcare side. Like, you're using it for workflow, obviously, right? For Wellconnected, are you?
So I'm using it for my development workflow, and
But for also like patient care in terms of connecting them to the different.
so we've been testing. We're in early testing phases because we've created embeddings based on our service directories and qualifications, inclusion, exclusion criteria, things like that. We've had good results. We're not in a phase of development now to do the statistical testing to make sure it's not as biased. But where it has immediately provided value is, and this was just kind of a weird side thing, right? Was looking at, so the U.S. government puts out a feed of all the clinical trials that are going on in the country, right? Like and with their inclusion and exclusion criteria and all this stuff, but they're hot garbage in terms of structure, right? So like Circuit Clinical, like so much of their business model was just based on scraping that and trying to get the inclusion and exclusion criteria. Well, that's a no-brainer now. Now it's just summarization, right? So we've looked at that for complex inclusion and exclusion criteria to try to parse it out. I don't know. I see promise, but it's not there. I mean, it's not.
Where do you see like it being used now, like in use cases? For example, I just lost what I was going to actually ask you.
Open ChatGPT.
Yeah.
Remind me what I was about to say.
But as for like employee knowledge base or
So I tell you. So I told a consulting client the other day in just conversation, right? They were complaining about dealing with benefits rejections for transitional housing and something else. I can't remember what it was. And I was like, well, you should just put the description of benefits, which the insurance company has to provide, right? The denial letter, right? Put them both in a ChatGPT, give it a little bit of context, redact any protected health information, give it a little bit of context, and ask it to write the letter, the appeal letter.
Yeah.
And
I'm sure it'll get it. I'm sure if you say that, it'll be
and
fine.
not one, but this guy who's a social worker has been generating boom, and it's now like not only freed them up, it's been more effective. It's you know what I mean, and then been able to ship them off with the client. Like it's been amazing, So the feedback, and it was off of a conversation that was like,
yeah, why not?
Why not? Give it a try.
So how do you see this spreading? I'm sorry, I don't know your name, but you have all these use cases where it can be effective now. It doesn't require, sorry, I don't remember your name either, but somebody like you to actually help go develop it, design it, code it, deploy it.
Right.
People can actually go use it, but there's probably restrictions depending on who you work for, the type of companies, privacy. But like, how do you envision people that are not tech nerds getting educated on this, either within companies or outside? I mean, I think the example of what you're doing here at Canisius is a perfect example of that. But how does it get bigger?
More broad.
Microsoft Office.
Like social workers.
Yes.
Really?
It gets embedded in Microsoft Office.
And
That's
it
the
will.
answer.
Yeah, it's coming this fall.
What is
Yeah.
this? Or do I have the latest version of it, right? I don't think the average, social worker or call center worker is really thinking about this.
They don't have to. It's going to be transparent.
But not now. I mean, it's getting there, but it's not now.
It is now. My phone auto completes every damn thing I type into it.
Wow.
Right? Like, so I'm really serious.
It's coming hard. It's going to be built. The betas were out this spring.
I am a co-pilot. I am a Microsoft Office co-pilot.
Within Word and
Word
Excel
and
and tools like that. That's going to be widespread this fall.
Yeah.
So
And
you're not going to go to another website. It's just part of Word now.
It's going to be in a context menu. It's going to be in a
Yeah.
right-click context menu that says, fix this.
Yeah.
And acritically, it's just going to say, fix this.
But I meant more in your example of like the social worker who was able to figure out, or based on your advice, like take this, generate this, you're probably going to get a better result, you're going to save your time. I meant that, like that.
How can we get people to adopt new technology?
Improve the productivity of the worker, but also the outcome of the patient in that example. That's what I was more on.
Yeah.
I think that's always been a struggle, right? With getting anyone to adopt new technology. There's always going to be some resistance there.
But OpenAI, you can just like download on your phone.
I know, you
And
can do it on your
that's-
phone,
I think
on a
the
website,
fact
yeah.
that it's an app is the.
Right.
Yes.
So ideally, what I would like to do personally in our application is I would like to embed it to generate those letters.
Yeah.
Right? Like if you're a social worker referring someone to a nonprofit, right, or referring someone to a food
Yep.
bank, and you have to create a summary that's going to get sent along with them that doesn't include protected health information, or as you say specifically, this person is an undocumented migrant and doesn't want to take the risk of social charge problems for using public services.
But who's going to do that? Right? Who's going to do that integration?
Me, that's our job. That's what I work on.
There you go.
That's
Yeah.
actually part of like consulting. So I'm a consultant myself, and part of like the first thing usually dealing with companies that's why I'm here, because I'm trying to understand this AI and how is, like, for example, a startup company can use generative AI, and part of it is the literacy process. So you mentioned there's already products that a lot of companies use. You mentioned Microsoft. Tableau has generative AI in there. Amazon QuickSight also has generative AI. So the role of the consultant is to come in and show people in these roles, like, hey, this is how you can ask these things questions to get feedback. And as it becomes more widespread, you can be able to understand use cases here, what we're talking about, or trying to. You can show people, okay, instead of doing your job role this way, you can use this generative AI and ask it these features, and it can go through an iterative process and reduce all this time that would normally take you to do your traditional job role.
I presented it to a group of K through 8 educators. Did it on St. Patrick's Day when it was coming out to it. It was like they had a day off, and I think reflecting upon it now, it was great that all the teachers were there, because then you have the cross section of everybody who has the same set of problems day to day in education and then you had the right set of people who immediately, as soon as I did it, because you had a section of like 60 or like 50 people from that organization, like 3 or 4 started raising their hand, like, what about this? Could I do this with it? Could I do this with it? You got to get like a group of people. You can't just go individually. If you have like a wide audience and you show it to them, I don't want to say like the most creative people, but maybe they're the most creative people. They're like, we should do this, this, and this with it, and it's going to save us this much time and solve all these problems that we have. And that's just it. I mean, some people are naturally going to be like, I can do this with it. And then that's how you're going to get traction.
Deploy this to secretaries.
Yeah.
Well,
it does really well at is boilerplate communication.
So do it, and then other people.
The more stereotyped it is, the better it does.
It does, and then at that same school that I presented it to, like other people, it got them thinking, and they would find themselves in situations, and they're like, I should just go to ChatGPT and ask it how to do this. And then they would go, my wife is at the school, and she'd be like, oh, this person said that they were proud because they decided to use ChatGPT because they had this problem, and they knew it was going to take this amount of time to do it. And I'm like, wow, let me ask ChatGPT to get me started. And then it like gave them a solution that took them 85% of the way there. And I'm like, oh, this is great.
And we're talking about ChatGPT pretty exclusively.
Yeah, exactly.
And Copilot and some other things we've talked about tangentially.
Yeah.
But like, has anybody here made a PowerPoint presentation recently?
Made a what?
PowerPoint presentation
yes,
recently?
I have.
Photoshop.
So you design assistant, right? Looks at the keywords in your slides and starts like recommending icons and layouts and things, and it changes on the fly. When you point out to somebody that's DALL-E, that's it. That's OpenAI's API. Like it's just restricted to that constraint, right? It won't. You know what I mean? You can't do like make George Washington riding a motorcycle. Right? You can't do that.
It's
But
guiding you through the process versus.
right. But it's transparent. Right. The use of the AI now looks like just another design tool.
I did my first PowerPoint where I used DALL-E stuff. And I was like, I want something that looks like this. I'm like, I want a pie shape that's got tons of wedges in it, and but lots of really small ones and little pieces, and it didn't write. Gave me that nice pie shape, but then it gave it like a pizza crust on it, like a 3D pizza crust around it. And I was like, good enough. I'm like, I'm going to use this.
So my favorite thing I've done, so one of my favorite things I've done with GPT before, so far, with this technology so far is, so I use Power BI a lot. I'm a big Power BI fan. I think it's great. So for a number of reasons. It's very cheap. It's accessible to a lot of people. It feels like Excel, right? So it works really well for adoption. But you can create graphics just from SVGs, so just from scalable vector graphics, right? So I used DALL-E to try to create the infographic that I wanted to kind of replicate. And then I took that image and uploaded it to GPT via the API and said, give me the SVG calculations that would return this graphic. And then I pulled that in and I added variables for my data points, for my metrics, and published it to Power BI. And now I have a dynamic, real-time, magazine quality infographic where little people's bodies fill up, right, as the population numbers change.
That's awesome.
Right? And so, because it's just algebra, right? Like it knows algebra, right? Like it's so, any case where you can reduce the problem space to a mathematical space, like a vector space, like you're halfway there.
So,
Go ahead.
I don't want to cut off questions. It is
I know,
now just a little bit after. No, it's been terrific, right? And really, we've had the same thing we have with a lot of our internal discussions. It means it just goes and goes and goes. We can continue. I don't want to cut off your question. Why don't we do that? Why don't we get that one more question and then join everybody else downstairs and get a little bit of food and water and things like that and talk. But let's get your question in because I don't want to cut you off. So,
this is a big macro question. I don't know your name.
I'm Jake.
Jake?
Jake. Jake from State Farm.
Right.
Oh, you're from Moog.
That's it.
So, I'm imagining, I mean, there's a bazillion startups in the AI space, right?
Absolutely.
And each one is focusing on, I assume, particular problems that run. Yours is on this medical transcription for PT. Is that, I mean, that's a fair assessment of the landscape of the startup landscape?
Yes, everybody.
And
you don't have AI in your
company,
name,
obviously. I don't remember your name.
Well, Jamie.
Jamie. You have two companies, and you're using AI personally and then also leveraging it?
Yeah, we haven't leveraged it in production yet,
But
you know,
thinking
but
of-
we're trying to figure out, yeah,
But
because
so
we've been
that's-
dumb.
that's
Every
the-
investor is gonna ask me,
How
do
are
you
you?
guys have an AI play? Like, how do you think, like, 2 years ago it was blockchain, right? Like,
Yeah.
what's your blockchain play?
We're still
Right.
relevant.
You know? No, we actually do have a very interesting blockchain model, but like it's, anyway, yeah.
So that's just my global question, is that there's however many, we'll just say, hundreds times more than that probably.
Sure, thousands of
But
startups.
Thousands, and that's where all the VCs are going, that's why they're gonna say,
Sure.
is there AI involved, et cetera. But then for these specific
Niche cases.
use cases in
Yeah.
which
Right.
you have to have a knowledge base to actually, I mean.
Be
you
applicable, right?
teach people who
To
are.
be useful.
Yeah, experts, okay.
But there's technology and compliance standards that you have to fit in
That other people don't.
that other people don't. So a lot of what I see is just as somebody with a little bit of web design and API knowledge who's managed to wrap just another OpenAI endpoint in a fancy interface,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Like, and this one does recipes, and this one does beer things, and this, like, it's like,
And that's a lot of what it'll be right
yeah,
now.
it's a lot of chat.
You'll see that for the next 3 years.
So it's like .com, this is before your era, but I think.
AI bubble?
So it's like the .com era was just like everything, you know, under the
I-
sun was tossed money and then half of it was just total
Mhm.
bomb.
Yeah, I think the difference is there's a lot less money going around now.
Yeah, that I was, but I believe that.
Yeah.
Because it already all went out.
Yeah.
Every lost it all.
And interest rates went up, so
Yeah.
Yeah.
unfortunately.
But maybe that refines the ideas to being better and more executable.
It makes startups have to make money now, right?
Well,
We operated in a mode for 10 years where you were supposed to lose money. Like that
Right.
was the goal, scale as fast as you can.
Right.
Now if you can't raise, you actually have to be profitable.
Yep.
So you'll get better ideas, better companies out of it.
Yeah.
Better companies that are more likely to make money that will grow slower. So innovation will go slower, right? Innovation as a whole may go slower because of that.
Which is probably a good thing.
I think you're gonna see fewer acqui-hires.
Yeah.
I think you're gonna see fewer acquisitions just to get the staff expertise. So it used to be a lot of times if you were doing all right, you could run down and you could get an acqui-hire. You could have somebody buy you just for your engineering expertise, dilute the process. You know, if you have a good patent or something, maybe they'll shelve it or whatever. But they want your skill and expertise. There's not that much expertise required to deploy an OpenAI API.
Okay.
It's just not. You can actually go to ChatGPT and say, I want to create an application based on this API.
Right.
Here's my key, and it'll spit you out a single page web app.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like you can do it in an afternoon.
Yep.
And so I think you're going to see a lot fewer acquirers. It used to be a lot harder to get visibility.